Think knights were noble heroes riding off into the sunset, winning the hearts of fair maidens? Think again. The medieval knight you see in movies is about as accurate as a Disney princess documentary. Real knights weren't gallant warriors. They were basically armed thugs in expensive metal suits, living in a world so brutal that most modern people wouldn't survive their first day. Everything you think you know about knighthood, honor, glory, romance, was carefully crafted propaganda. The reality was poverty, disease, violence, and a social system designed to crush both body and spirit. Most knights were broke, not struggling to pay rent broke. We're talking selling family heirlooms to afford horse feed broke. The medieval economy was stacked against them. Sure, they got land grants, but that land came with massive obligations. They had to provide military service, maintain expensive equipment, support their households, and fund their own wars. Basically, it was a job where they paid their employer instead of the other way around. A single suit of armor cost more than a peasant would earn in 15 years. A decent war horse? Another decade of wages. Add weapons maintenance, training, and servants. And you're looking at costs that would make modern luxury car payments seem reasonable. Many knights borrowed money just to meet these obligations, mortgaging lands, pawning family weapons, and sometimes even selling their daughters into marriage to survive. Some noble families went extinct simply because they couldn't afford the knightly lifestyle. Meanwhile, the wealthiest lords weren't fighting. They were lending money at crushing interest rates. Medieval capitalism, wrapped in the pretty bow of honor and service. And if a knight got injured and couldn't fight, game over. No pensions, no disability benefits, just poverty and shame until death. The rich, powerful knight image comes from the top 1% of nobility. The dukes and earls who could actually afford the lifestyle. Everyone else was one lost battle or bad harvest away from ruin. Living in armor was another nightmare. Going to the bathroom was a massive ordeal. Knights couldn't just step away. They needed at least 2 servants to help remove pieces of armor, which could take 20 minutes. In the middle of a campaign or siege, many knights simply went inside their armor. Some suits had primitive drainage systems, but the experience was less than glamorous. Castles had communal toilets over moats or rivers, no privacy, and certainly no toilet paper. Personal hygiene was just as grim. Knights bathed maybe 3 or 4 times a year, believing that washing too much weakened the body and made them vulnerable to disease. The same undergarments could be worn for months, creating perfect conditions for lice, fleas, and infections. Their solution? Heavy perfumes and spices to mask odors. And they thought this was normal. Cleanliness was considered weak, even heretical. Filth equaled virtue. Armor was not only heavy, but also deadly in its own way. Full-plate suits could reach internal temperatures over 120 degrees Fahrenheit in the sun. Knights regularly died from heat exhaustion before they even faced an enemy. Metal trapped heat, making breathing nearly impossible. During the Crusades, knights in desert climates dropped like flies. Their armor, meant to protect them, became a killer. Desperate knights tried pouring cold water through armor gaps or wearing ice-soaked cloths, which melted almost immediately in summer. Some fought only in the early morning or late evening, but battles rarely followed their schedules. Many developed permanent health problems, kidney damage, heart conditions, neurological issues. Some were lucky enough just to pass out and survive. The romantic image of knights riding valiantly into battle couldn't be further from the truth. They lived on the edge of poverty, cooked alive in their own armor, and were constantly at risk of disease and death. The life of a medieval knight was not about honor or glory. It was about survival in a world that would break both your body and your mind. Medieval tournaments weren't the friendly jousts you see in movies. They were basically legalized murder disguised as entertainment. What we call tournaments today were originally called melees, massive free-for-alls where the only rule was try not to kill too many people. Emphasis on try. A single tournament could leave dozens of knights dead and hundreds more injured. Spectators cheered as men were trampled by horses, crushed by fallen opponents, or beaten to death with blunt weapons. Losing didn't just mean injury, it could mean financial ruin. Defeated knights had to surrender their horses, armor, and weapons to the victors. For those living on the edge, this was total disaster. Many knights literally risked their lives to avoid bankruptcy, fighting beyond their limits because surrender meant their families would starve. The weapons weren't dulled or modified for safety. Swords, lances, warhammers, anything designed to crush armor or skulls was fair game. Medical care consisted mostly of prayers from monks, and if a knight didn't regain consciousness within a few hours, they started planning the funeral. Chroniclers describe audiences vomiting from the carnage, and even seasoned medieval viewers sometimes fainted at the sight of men being literally torn apart. Yet knights kept coming back. Social pressure was brutal. Being branded a coward meant total loss of status. Death in the arena, as horrific as it was preferable to dishonor. But tournaments were only part of the story. Knights weren't just warriors. They were professional kidnappers running a medieval extortion business. Capturing enemy knights alive was far more profitable than killing them. Battlefields became chaotic hunting grounds where knights tried to knock each other unconscious rather than deliver lethal blows. Ransoms were calculated based on social rank, land holdings, family wealth, and political importance. Some ransoms could bankrupt entire villages or even kingdoms. The most ruthless knights would ignore military objectives just to capture a wealthy opponent, letting greed dictate strategy. The psychological torment for captured knights was deliberate. They were fed well, allowed books, and sometimes given exercise, all to keep them valuable for ransom. Families who couldn't pay faced the horrifying possibility that their relative would be executed. Some captives spent decades in these conditions. King John II of France, captured at the Battle of Poitiers, spent 4 years in captivity while his ransom nearly bankrupted France, sparking revolts. Knights often formed bonds with their captors over time, only to return to battle and possibly fight the same people years later. Medieval warfare was a violent social club where yesterday's host could be today's opponent. Religion complicated things even further. Knights were supposed to be holy warriors, but most of their lives involved actions that would make demons blush. The church developed elaborate rituals to reconcile brutality with faith. Killing enemies, even civilians, was framed as a religious duty, proof of devotion, a ticket to heaven. This created immense psychological strain. Knights prayed for divine blessing in the morning and massacred entire villages in the afternoon. They could attend mass covered in blood, take communion with hands that had strangled prisoners, and believe they were serving God. the mental toll was severe. Many knights developed what we would now recognize as PTSD. Those unable to reconcile faith and violence were labeled heretics or madmen. Some became religious fanatics, seeing enemies everywhere and interpreting every conflict as holy. Others abandoned faith entirely, using religious language to justify personal brutality. Some genuinely believed they were saints while committing atrocities, torturing prisoners while reciting prayers, burning villages while singing hymns. Chroniclers recorded knights talking to imaginary angels, experiencing violent visions, or withdrawing completely from society. Chivalry, as we understand it, was essentially a medieval PR campaign designed to control armed psychopaths, and it often failed spectacularly. When legitimate income couldn't support their lifestyle, knights turned to private warfare, essentially organized crime. They extorted merchants at sword point, occupied abandoned castles as fortresses, and launched raids on nearby villages. Some even issued their own currency and protection rackets. The most notorious example, Guts von Berlichingen, spent decades as a medieval warlord, kidnapping merchants, extorting cities, and fighting anyone who crossed him, claiming he was defending his honor. During the 100 Years' War, unemployed knights formed mercenary companies, switching sides based on who paid better. These free companies would sack villages in the morning and raid supply lines in the afternoon, loyalty dictated by profit. Peasants suffered most, as there was little legal protection against knights. Local lords often ignored complaints because they relied on knights for military service. Entire regions became lawless. Merchants wouldn't dare travel, and peasants couldn't safely work their fields. The very system designed to protect society ended up creating armed predators who preyed on the weak. So, next time you think modern life is tough, remember the reality of medieval knights. Your job might be stressful, but at least you're not risking your life daily, slowly roasting in metal armor and being kidnapped for ransom. Their world was violent, brutal, and unforgiving, where survival required skill, luck, and often a complete disregard for morality. Even the wealthiest knights faced impossible contradictions. They were supposed to be holy warriors, yet their lives were filled with violence, cruelty, and moral compromise. Religion tried to justify the chaos. Knights were told that killing enemies of the faith guaranteed a place in heaven. Massacres became acts of devotion, and the blood spilled on battlefields was framed as righteous. But the human mind wasn't so easily fooled. Many knights suffered in silence, torn between their faith and their actions. Some went mad, convinced they were saints while committing atrocities. Others abandoned their religion entirely, using the language of faith to justify personal brutality. Chroniclers of the time recorded countless stories of knights talking to imaginary angels, having vivid religious visions, or withdrawing completely from society. Some became hermits, retreating into isolation to escape the psychological torment. The code of chivalry, often romanticized today, was really a way to contain armed psychopaths, but it failed more often than it succeeded. Knights who couldn't maintain their lifestyle through legitimate means turned to organized crime. They would extort merchants at sword point, occupy abandoned castles, and launch raids on villages. They even created their own currencies and protection rackets. One of the most notorious, Guts von Berlichingen, spent decades as a medieval warlord, kidnapping, extorting, and waging private wars, always claiming he was defending his honor. During the 100 Years' War, entire companies of unemployed knights operated as mercenaries, switching sides depending on who paid more. One day they'd sack French villages, the next they'd raid English supply lines. Loyalty was for sale, and profit was the only constant. Peasants suffered the most. Local lords often turned a blind eye because they needed knights for military campaigns. Entire regions descended into lawlessness. Merchants wouldn't travel, fields went unworked, and the very system meant to protect society became a breeding ground for armed predators. The psychological toll extended beyond warfare and crime. Knights faced constant fear of financial ruin, injury, and social disgrace. A single lost battle could strip them of everything: horses, weapons, land, even their family's future. Many lived in a state of perpetual anxiety, gambling with life and death in every conflict. Tournaments, once considered sport, were deadly spectacles where losing could mean total destruction. Ransoms added another layer of stress. Captured knights could spend years in captivity, and their families would risk everything to pay their freedom. Failure often led to death, financial collapse, or both. Even the rules of honor offered little protection. Knights were constantly balancing moral contradictions: loyalty to their liege, adherence to chivalric codes, religious obligations, and the practical need to survive and profit. These contradictions created an environment where mental breakdowns were inevitable. Some knights developed what we would now recognize as PTSD. Others became obsessive fanatics, seeing enemies and threats everywhere, interpreting every encounter as part of a divine struggle. And yet, despite the brutality, chaos, and constant danger, knights continued to serve. They fought because social expectations demanded it. They competed because honor required it. They survived because their choices were limited. Life as a medieval knight was an endless cycle of violence, moral compromise, and psychological strain. The romantic tales of gallant heroes and noble deeds are largely just that: tales. The reality was far darker. A world where armor couldn't protect against the cruelty of human nature, financial desperation, or the contradictions of faith. When you think about modern life, it really puts things into perspective. Today's soldiers have protocols, medical care, and psychological support. Modern workplaces have safety regulations, labor laws, and social security nets. Medieval knights had prayer, primitive surgery, and the constant threat of collapse: financial, social, and physical. They lived in a world where your job could literally kill you, and honor often demanded that you risk your life daily. The Age of Knights teaches a harsh lesson about human ambition, social hierarchy, and the consequences of extreme expectations. It reminds us that historical myths, romanticized images of gallantry and chivalry, often hide the uncomfortable truth. Survival in medieval Europe demanded brutality, cunning, and a willingness to endure unimaginable hardship. Knights were not the heroes of legend. They were men trapped in a system that pushed their bodies, minds, and morality to the absolute limit. And so, when you hear tales of knights riding into glorious battles, remember the reality behind the metal: blood, sweat, fear, and the heavy burden of a world that demanded far more than any human could naturally give. History, in all its raw and unfiltered truth, is often stranger and far more brutal than any storybooks we read.